no need.
All right, thank you very much. We've got the topic on the screen, the impact of mindfulness on the brain, scientific evidence. So this is a talk by Professor Kolitha Sellahewa, who has given many talks before at the Servants of the Buddha. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Kolitha Sellahewa to deliver his talk.
President and the board of directors of the Servants of the Buddha and all our Dhamma friends who are joined in from many parts of this world. Let me begin this talk by first thanking Emeritus Professor Manori Senanayaka for inviting me to deliver this talk today. And also I had to thank Anoja for chipping in at the last moment to chair this meeting and also for your kind words of introduction. Thank you very much, Anoja. Now, in this talk, the nature of this talk is such that I like to talk about the brain and mindfulness. So at the very outset, I need to confess that I'm not an expert in mindfulness, nor am I a neurologist to talk about the brain. My experience, expertise, and most of the research I have done has been on snakebite and dengue. But nevertheless, when I started looking into this subject of the brain and meditation, I found it such an exceedingly fascinating area of research, I was virtually drawn into it. So with my humble apologies to all the neurologists in this audience, I'd like to take you through some of these neurological pathways and so on to see the impact of mindfulness on the brain. So in this presentation, I'll be touching on mindfulness and also the scientific methods and understanding of which is necessary to make any meaningful progress in this talk. I will also talk about the structure and function of the brain and also something about brain waves, clear knowledge of which is essential to understand the rest of the talk. And my apologies here again. I have to use this. It's a bit of a technical talk, so some technical terms will be used mainly for the benefit of the non-medical participants in this audience today. But I'll try to keep this medical jargon to the bare minimum, but in certain situations, I'll have to use some of these technical terms because it will be unavoidable. Now, after grounding you all on this basic information, we'll look at the way meditation has impacted structural and functional changes in the brain, what neuroplasticity is all about, and I shall take you through some experimental evaluations and present the research and the evidence base on which these assertions have been made. And I shall end this presentation by looking at the extent to which these brain changes could impact the day-to-day practice of those of you all who are treading the path, the Eighth Noble Path towards liberation. Now, mindfulness, Dhamma friends, is nothing new. It's a practice that had prevailed all over the world, particularly in the eastern part of the world, the eastern countries, for several thousands of years. And it is claimed that this has been there for as much as over 4,000 years. But in that era, the practice of meditation was mainly on faith and belief. And then it went from generation to generation, it became a tradition. But among these practitioners, however, there were also some who experienced the benefits of meditation by practicing. And this experiential realization of benefit of meditation served to sustain this practice over several thousands of years. Then with the turn of the 21st century, there was a greater awareness of meditation, and this heightened the interest of meditation in general, mainly because of the material gain that came with the practice of meditation. And then this doctrine spread to the West. Once it went to the West, it awakened the interest of scientists. And now scientists won't accept anything just on belief and faith. they need scientific evidence of benefit. So as a result, quite a large number of research studies was done in this area in the last 2 decades or so. Now, mindfulness, very simply, is a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. One becomes totally aware of the thoughts, the feelings, and the physical being all the time at this present moment. So it's very difficult to define mindfulness, but in very simple terms, mindfulness is the non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. Now, the research on mindfulness and its impact on the brain was not a one-man show. It is the result of painstaking, very hard, collaborative research which had addressed all these areas: neuroscience, psychology, neurobiology, as well as genetics. Now, scientific methods, the scientists try to determine the benefit of an intervention by doing what are called clinical trials, of which there are several types. There are the cross-sectional studies, the longitudinal studies, observation and epidemiological studies, as well as randomized control trials. So up to date, there have been over 6,000 research papers on meditation. And of all these different clinical trials, what is most appropriate, what is really appropriate for meditation are these longitudinal studies rather than cross-sectional studies. Because in a cross-sectional study, you are comparing the effect of an intervention at the same time point. But in a longitudinal study, you do intervention, follow up the patients over several weeks, months, or even years, and see what sort of changes takes place. So from the context of meditation, longitudinal studies will be more impactful than cross-sectional studies. But as far as clinical trials are concerned, the gold standard of benefit of an intervention comes from what are called randomized controlled trials. Now, in randomized controlled trials, two groups of patients with similar demographics and baseline characteristics are divided into two groups. One is the treatment group where the intervention is tested. The other is a control group. And the outcomes of these trials are clearly identified well in advance, and the results are analyzed statistically, and the investigators make some conclusions to ascertain not only the benefit, but also the safety of an intervention. Now, towards the latter part of the last century, there was only one randomized control trial. Then with the beginning of this century, there were 11 randomized control trials. Now, randomized control trials, my friends, is the gold standard of benefit. Then in this year, 2013 to 2015, there were 216 randomized control trials. And these trials had shown benefits not only among healthy individuals, but also on certain disease states, both physical and mental, like irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, psoriasis, and certain mental disorders like anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorders. So even though we have several thousands of research studies done in this area, this research is still very much in its infancy. Now, these are some of the centers in which these research studies had been carried out: the Massachusetts General Hospital, and over 250 independent universities and research institutions in 33 countries. All these countries have been in the West. And also some very prestigious medical schools like Harvard, UCLA, and Yale. A lot of money has been pumped to do this research, several millions of dollars, so they can do high-powered quality research on the impact of meditation on the brain and other regions of the body. Now, in any scientific experiment, we identify the objectives of assessment and then see the benefits of many. In that regard, in these meditative practices, they have looked at the benefits among healthy individuals as well as individuals with certain health issues. And the identified objects were structural changes, physiological and the biochemical changes, as well as going even still deeper to see what changes meditation has had on the genetic constitution of an individual. Now, in order to make these objective assessments, we have to make use of certain tools to assess this. So, for instance, if you want to know what the blood pressure is, if that is objective assessment, then you've got to use an instrument to measure the blood pressure, which you are familiar with, the sphygmomanometer. Similarly, if you are going to make objective assessment of the changes in the brain, then we've got to use some very specific tools for that purpose of assessment, and this constitutes structural MRI, functional MRI, electroencephalogram, which you call EEG, as well as quantitative EEGs. And some studies have also made use of the vital parameters, simple physiological parameters like the heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. What happens to these as a result of meditation? And there are also studies that have looked at the hormonal changes that takes place when meditation is an intervention, and also about cytokines. Cytokines are chemical mediators that are released in inflammatory disorders, and they have also looked into the genetic changes that takes place as a result of meditation. Now, these MRI scanner, when the subject is put into this machine, it creates a magnetic field around the subject. Now, our body, most of the body is composed of water. Water is H2O. So these hydrogen atoms is in a perpetual spin on its own axis. And when a magnetic field is created, these hydrogen atoms align itself on this magnetic field. And when electrical impulse is generated, there's a transient alteration of this alignment of the hydrogen atoms. It emits a signal, and this signal is picked up by the computer, and based on the different in the densities of the tissues, the computer constructs a digital image of these different tissues in the brain. Now, this, my friends, forms the basis of a structural MRI, a very important tool that has been used to assess changes in the brain when in meditating individuals. Now, this is a functional MRI. What happens here is whenever we perform a task, a certain area of the brain gets activated. And for that area, there's a transient increase in the blood flow. With that, there will be increase in the concentration of hydrogen atoms in that area of activation of the brain. And the MRI picks up these areas of activation and gives out a digital printout of this with various colors responsible for the activation of these different areas of the brain in relation to the activity that is performed. Now, another tool which is very useful in this research studies in studying the brain is to study the electrical activity in the brain. You may have heard about this electroencephalogram. Now, the brain, all the time, there's some electrical activity and it's emitting various kinds of waves. And these have been classified depending on the frequency of the waves as well as its amplitude as gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. Now, gamma waves of the brain has the highest frequency and the lowest amplitude, and these gamma waves are emitted when the brain is at peak concentration. And delta waves, on the other hand, has a very low amplitude. These are slow waves, and that is what we see when the individual is sleeping. And they are not, and there's a lot of reduction in the awareness of a person in that state of sleep, and that starts emitting delta wave. So electroencephalogram picks up these by fixing surface electrodes to the head, just like the ECG. You are familiar with the ECG. There's electrical activity in the heart, and by placing electrodes in the region of the chest, we can pick up those electrical activity and then give a graph on that. Similarly, all this electrical activity of the brain is picked up by connecting electrodes to the surface of the head, and then you get these characteristic wave patterns on the string. Few other technical terms we need to be familiar with is what is called brain morphology. And brain morphology refers to the brain structure, its shape and composition, and tests that measure these morphometric measurements of the studying the morphology by using neuroimaging techniques is called morphometric neuroimaging. So that will measure and analyze the brain morphology and characterize all the anatomical differences in the brain. And this is done by structural MRI. Now, functional neuroimaging is done by studying the brain activity, its electrical potentials, and the blood flow. And the instruments used to do that are the functional MRI, EEG, and PET scanning. Now, a few words about neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change and adapt. Now, when we were medical students, I think this concept of neuroplasticity had existed, I think, from the beginning of the last century. But not much of prominence was given to it except very recently, only in the recent past, that scientists began to identify the importance of neuroplasticity, which simply refers to the ability of the brain to change and adapt to different situations. And of this, there are two different kinds. One is called structural plasticity, where our experiences and memories are capable of changing the physical structure of the brain. That is structural plasticity. And then if the function of the brain moves from a damaged area to an undamaged area, that is called functional plasticity. And that is also has been demonstrated in the recent past. So neuroplasticity then is the ability of the brain to change and adapt to certain situations. Now, as far as the gross structure of the brain is concerned, the brain is just another organ, just like the heart, lungs, and kidneys, which you're familiar with. It's all enclosed within our thoracic cavity and the abdomen, and the brain is enclosed within our head, the cranium. And essentially, there are two main halves of the brain, which we call hemispheres, and there are certain different parts are described anatomically as the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brain stem. Now, the surface of the brain is not smooth. The surface of the brain has a lot of convolutions. It's divided into what we call gyri, which are separated by sulci. Now, nature is marvelous. You can see this in this picture. Now, the surface of the brain, it's not smooth. There are a lot of convolutions. This is because of this gyri, and the sulci. Now, nature has a very good reason to do this. If it was a smooth surface, the surface area is small. By having this gyri, the surface area of the brain has been increased phenomenally because the brain is enclosed within a very limited capacity of the cranium. So the division of the brain into this gyri has increased the surface area of the brain to over 2,000 square centimeters, which would not have been possible if it was a smooth surface. And all these have very important functional implications. The corollary is that if any intervention can increase the gyrification of the brain, that will increase the surface area and its attendant functional benefits. Now, as far as the structure of the brain is concerned, there are 80 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. So just like the cells that compose all our different tissues, the cells that compose of which the brain is made up of are called neurons, which are cell bodies and dendrites. These are like tentacle-like processors in their cell body and axon leading away from it. Now the continuity of contact between two neurons is called a synapse. Now, there's no physical connection between two neurons. There's a gap between these dendrites, and impulses are transmitted across this gap using chemical-mediated chemical transmitters. We call those neurotransmitters. So it's very important to remember that it is the synapses where contact is maintained by contiguity without any physical continuity of the neurons. And what is important to keep in mind is that in this brain, there are trillions of such synapses. An increase in the number of synapses by branching of these dendrites and by making various connections would increase in a huge way the neuronal connections between different parts of the brain. It is called that synapsogenesis. Another area of importance I need to touch on at this juncture is about the limbic system. About the limbic system, yes. Now, all the primitive life, as far as primitive life is concerned, we need food for the survival of the individual and sex for the survival of the species. Those are the only two requirements of primitive life. Food for the survival of the individual and sex for the survival of the species. And the primitive brain is designed and adapted to control and regulate these two primary functions of primitive life. And that part of the brain which controls such behavior is called the limbic system. And of the limbic system, it's a very complex area of the brain. Three areas of prime importance, that is the hippocampus, amygdala, and the cingulate gyrus. Just remember these words. Now, when we were, again, junior doctors and even as medical students way back in 1968, I think our physiology books had only about 1 or 2 pages of the limbic system. This was never, our professors never lectured to us on the limbic system. There were no questions asked, no questions set in your exam papers. But since that was in 1968, but since then, science has advanced so much that this limbic system has assumed a place of great importance in our emotion regulation, and particularly in these research studies related to meditation and its impact on the brain. So just remember these three words, the hippocampus, amygdala, and the cingulate gyrus, which are some of the constituents of this limbic system, which is concerned with our primitive life or survival of the individual and survival of the species. That's a picture, a transection of the brain showing the medial side of it. And you can see this limbic system. What is in green? This is the cingulate cortex, and this is the hippocampus, and this tiny bit is the amygdala. It's the size of a gram, I think it's gram seed, very small amygdala. But it has such important role to play in regard to our emotional regulation. So that's the amygdala. Now, as far as the hippocampus is concerned, it's responsible for the memory. Now, whenever we get in some sense input into the brain, it goes to a specific area of the brain in relation to the modality of the sensation, and then signals are sent to the prefrontal cortex, that is what is found right in front, just behind our forehead, and that creates a short-term memory of that sense experience. Now, if you think that memory is important, experience is important, then this is sent, information is transferred to the hippocampus, for long-term storage. So all our learning, emotions, and this emotional processing, avoidance behavior is dependent on the memories stored in the hippocampus of our sense experiences. Now, as far as the functions of the amygdala is concerned, its attributes, all those emotions responsible for survival, like fear, aggression, and anxiety. Say if I come across, say if a lion comes across a monkey, say a monkey or a deer comes across a lion, then the deer gets frightened. There are a lot of fear and anxiety because, the lion is a threat to its life. So either the deer will make some aggressive behavior or run away from it to avoid being killed. So all these emotions related to parenting, caregiving, and emotions connected to memories and our learned behavior all depends on proper functioning of the amygdala. So the amygdala then, my friends, plays a role which is of critical importance in self-regulation and self-control. That is the primary function of the amygdala. So very simply talking then, whenever these sense inputs come into our brain, the amygdala adds emotional value to those sense inputs, and it creates in our brain a pre-conscious warning system. And that is what will drive us to either fight the threat or run away from the threat. So the fight or flight reaction is a result of a pre-conscious warning system created in our brain by adding emotional values by the amygdala to all the sensory inputs we have been experiencing. So with that background, with that fundamental information related to the brain and scientific methods, let's move now to see the impact of meditation in bringing about these structural changes, functional changes, and what impact meditation has on our emotions, hormones, as well as our genes. Now, both short-term and long-term training has been shown to cause an enhancement of our executive functions of attention, working memory, introspection, compassionate behavior, as well as improvements in our immune function and certain improvements in certain symptom disorders, in symptoms of certain clinical disorders like anxiety and depression. Now, when you look at all these benefits of meditation, it's such a broad spectrum of benefit. So naturally, people will become very skeptic as to how one simple intervention called meditation can bring about such a vast area of benefits in the human being. So they are very skeptic about it, and not surprising to be so. So the evidence of benefit. What scientists did was to evaluate, in order to evaluate the consistency and the practical significance of this huge body of results, they did what are called comprehensive meta-analysis of that data, and they found out there was robust evidence that meditation practice is associated with a wide array of benefit, particularly in regard to our cognition and emotional behavior. Now, this evidence in this direction is continuing to mount, and they are making even measurable effects on these areas of how meditation has impacted our brain, the body, and as well as our behavior. Now, coming on to something more specific, if you were to talk about the structural changes that come about in the brain as a result of meditation, there are some fundamentally important questions that for which we need answers. Firstly, we want to know whether meditation is associated with any structural changes in the brain. And if so, what is the magnitude of this change? And just because we see some changes in the brain structure, that does not necessarily mean that it is the meditation which brought about these changes. So establishing a causal relationship between meditation and observed structural changes in the brain is an exceedingly difficult task, mainly because most of the studies that have been done in relation to meditation have been cross-sectional studies. Longitudinal studies are lacking. So we are trying to seek scientific evidence to resolve a very complex problem. So what the methodology that scientists resorted to resolve this dilemma was to synthesize the literature available and do systematic reviews and a quantitative meta-analysis of all the morphometric neuroimaging studies on meditation. Now again, I have to use this term morphometric, where we are studying the structural changes, and structural changes can be determined by neuroimaging techniques. So we are looking at morphometric neuroimaging studies done on meditation. And there were thousands of such studies done, but most of it was pure crap. Very poor quality, can't replicate the results. So most of those were dumped, and these systematic reviews are very high quality, and they were able to pick up just 21 neuroimaging studies from thousands of publications. And there were 300 subjects, meditation practitioners in these studies. And what was found from this quantitative analysis and meta-analysis was that there were 8 regions of the brain which showed some very consistent structural changes. And the quality of these research studies was so of such a high level, they were able to map out very clearly in the fine details of the areas of the brain where these structural changes were observed by neuroimaging studies, and so depicted, indicated in this slide. And you can see there were changes in the longitudinal fascicle, that is what connects different parts of the brain on the same side. And the corpus callosum is like a bridge of neurons which connects the 2 sides of the brain, the 2 hemispheres. So changes were seen in all these. And the implications are that signal transfer can take place as a result of meditation between the 2 sides of the brain, as well as different regions on the same side of the hemisphere. Now, this is a study that was published last year, a meta-analysis that looked into 111 randomized control trials. And randomized control trials, you may remember, is the gold standard of benefit. There were a large number, 111 studies, with a large number of participants, over 9,500. And these studies and this meta-analysis revealed that mindfulness enhances cognitive function. If we move on to the structural changes of the brain into a little deeper level, it has been shown that the gray matter gets thicker. Another thing that happens with regard to the gray matter volume is as we age, this gray matter volume decreases in size. So if somebody were to do a MRI scan on me, my gray matter volume must be a minute fraction of what it was when I was a highly vibrant medical student when I was 20 years old. Now, what meditation does is to attenuate this age-related reduction in the gray matter volume. There's also plasticity of the brain. That also happens. It's another structural change that takes place in the brain as a result of meditation. Studies have shown that the hippocampus, which is concerned with our memory, increases in size. And the amygdala, concerned with our emotion regulation, decreases in size. So these are the neuroplasticity, the changes that have taken place in the structure of the brain as a result of meditation. And 7 hours of meditation has been shown to bring about these changes. And there were some studies where the participants went through a training program of 8 weeks, and that produced changes in the brain that was associated with our learning, emotions, as well as our memory. So in summary, then, the structure, the brain structure, the impact on the brain structure as a result of meditation is to increase the surface area by increasing the gyrification, increasing the cortical thickness, increasing the gray matter density, and an attenuation of age-related reduction in the gray matter volume. So very important impact of meditation on the brain structure. Now this graph shows this. You can see the meditator, these dark circles are the meditators, and the control group are the non-meditators with its red squares. And you can see this chap in his 50s has the same amount of gray matter density like what it was when he was about 38 years old. So the age-related, whereas in the non-meditators went down steeply with age. So this age-related reduction in gray matter density and the thickness is attenuated by meditation as an intervention. Another very interesting thing that happens at the level of chromosomes is the telomeres. Now, all these chromosomes are protected. The ends of the chromosomes are protected by these telomeres. It's caps which protect the chromosomes. And every time a cell divides, this telomere length decreases. You can see with continuing cell division, telomere length gets shorter and shorter, and eventually disappears altogether. And with that, cell division ceases. Now, what meditation does is to increase the length of telomeres. And it was probably it's working by reducing stress. Stress has been shown to be reduced by in meditators. And stress inhibits an enzyme called telomerase, which is responsible for the shortening of the telomeres. So reduction of stress inhibits telomerase and maintains the length of telomeres. Short telomere length has also been shown to be associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease as well as cancers. In another experiment, the flu virus was given to meditators and non-meditators, and meditators produced more antibodies. So all these changes at a cellular level are very important. Meditation seems to attenuate the age-related reduction in the telomere length and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and cancers, and also improve our immune function. Sorry. Now, mindfulness meditation causes an improvement in our emotion regulation. And the evidence base for this improved emotion regulation comes from self-reported studies as well as certain experimental studies, and using simple, measurable, easily measurable physiological parameters like heart rate and blood pressure, and also neuroimaging techniques, which have shown that there is an improvement in our emotion regulation as a result of meditation. Now, there is one such experiment in which the study participants are presented with emotional pictures, words, and statements, all with the objective of arousing their increasing the emotional arousal. So these were emotion stimulating pictures, words, and statements. Now, they were made to encounter this emotional stimulation both during mindfulness and at a simple baseline state. And what they found was there was a down regulation of the activities of the amygdala. And that is control. That is what is involved in our emotional response. Now, this is a functional MRI scan which shows a high level of activity of the amygdala before meditation, and these subjects went through an 8-week training program on meditation, and these MRI scans are repeated and showed a reduction in the activity of the amygdala after 6 weeks of training. Now, this is another very interesting experiment that was carried out in comparing the reaction to emotion in novice meditators and experienced meditators. Excuse me. Now, when novice meditators were exposed to emotional stimuli, neuroimaging studies showed an enhancement of the activation of the prefrontal cortex, that is the area in front. And at the same time, there was a diminution in the activation of the amygdala. So, emotional stimulation, novice meditators, there was an increase in precortical activation as well as a reduction in the amygdala. So these two factors together decrease the emotional arousal. So it appears that in these novice meditators, an active cognitive regulation came into play to attenuate the emotional arousal. This is concluded by the activation seen in the prefrontal cortex. This was because of the need to overcome our habitual ways of internally reacting to emotional stimuli. Somebody was to shout at me, blame me, then we are habitually tuned to shout back, hit back. Now that is the need, but in novice meditators, they brought in some cognitive control to regulation to control this emotional outburst. Now this was quite different to what was observed in experienced meditators. In them, there was no activation of the prefrontal cortex. So it looks as if the need to bring about cognitive control did not arise from them because of their experience in meditation. They had developed a sort of automated stance of acceptance of their emotional experiences. So they become sort of emotionally passive. You go on blaming them, nothing happens. No change of expression. You can see it happened in the Buddha. If you think of the stories in Buddha times, so many people scolded him, made accusations. He never reacted. This is because of the acceptance of their automated stance of acceptance of emotional experience. And I have seen some doctors also like this in my day-to-day practice. Working with doctors, there are times when one guy, I try to pick up whenever there's something wrong in I see in the ward rounds or this guy in the ICU, then I pull them up and tell them to correct these things, correct, not with the intention of finding fault with them, but always to improve and the quality of care, improve the quality. Even a minor mistake, I'll see. But there's one doctor, whatever I tell him, he doesn't get moved by that. But there are some lady doctors, you tell these things, they become very sad. Sometimes they get so sad, they even start crying, but not this guy. He's absolutely impassive to all this pulling up. So one day, the curious as I am, I want to know why is this guy reacting like, not reacting. Then I found out he's a very experienced meditator. He has been meditating for donkey's years, and he's following this fasting, and he's very slim also. And I haven't seen any change in him from the first time I met him about 12 years ago. He's still the same. So he knows all about quantum physics, meditation, gone to town on that, and we can see the result. He's emotionally impassive. So this is not experiment, but actual experience of personal experience. So here again, it shows the changes in the activity of the brain before and after meditation. This is another study that looked into the electrical activity of the brain. This is all shown in these dark colors, electrical activity. It was markedly reduced after 10 minutes of meditation. This is a quantitative EEG. And another quantitative EEG, which looked at the pattern of brain waves that were emitted before and after meditation. 20 minutes of meditation was associated with a marked reduction of beta waves. Now, these are the beta waves shown in this dark colors. They disappeared almost completely with just 20 minutes of meditation. Another study that looked that the study subjects were 34 novice meditators. After 6 weeks of intervention, they noticed the changes in the brain waves as well as a reduction in the respiratory rate. Now, this is a study that was carried out in our country, in this country, in the Nissarana monastery by Mahavithana Gay and others. The study subjects were monks who were practicing Vipassana mindfulness meditation. They looked at the EEG changes, they were practicing mindfulness meditation, and again, brainwave changes were detected by EEGs. And this is a very interesting experiment carried out by Richard Davidson. He is a world-renowned neuroscientist, and he used his subjects of study were Olympic level meditators. Now, these are people who have been meditating for over 62,000 hours, lifetime meditation. He got down these subjects from all over the country, mainly from Nepal, India, and France, to his lab in the University of Wisconsin. They followed very rigid protocols, used state-of-the-art scanner. They had a lot of money to do this. And what they found was that the strongest wave in the EEG spectrum of these Olympic level meditators was a profound increase in the gamma waves. Now, ordinary people, whenever we try to solve a problem, there's a transient increase in the gamma wave activity. Now, these meditators who have been meditating for more than 62,000 hours lifetime had a high level of gamma wave activities, and that was sustained and present all the time, even when they were not meditating. But what is most interesting is The moment they started meditating, there was a 700 to 800% increase in this gamma wave activity within seconds of meditation. So they had a very high level of concentration even in the resting state, and that peaked to more than 800% within seconds of meditation. And the technique of meditation that was practiced was loving kindness meditation. So certainly there's so many other independent investigators have looked into this electrical activity, and the general conclusion based on these electrical activities is that a meditating person is more relaxed but maintains sharp awareness. Even though they are relaxed, they are not sleeping. Their awareness is very, very sharp. So the impact of meditation on the brain is that it is a very active form of brain training, and changes in the brain are affected in a positive way, and it has a powerful impact on those regions of the brain concerned with stress, empathy, and the sense of self. And physical and mental relaxation is seen during meditation, as well as improvements in our cognitive and psychological functions. Another important thing to notice is that once you meditate, that benefits seem to last throughout the day. This is why it's so important to meditate. If you are meditating, better to start the day by meditating, so that when you go to work, you will meet a lot of stressful situations. You will be able to wade through all these stress situations without that affecting you. You can come back home quite calm and relaxed despite facing all these stressful situations, because the benefits of your cognitive and psychological behavior persist throughout the day. Now, this is a summary of the pathway of benefit. Mindfulness meditation gives rise to attention control, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. And these three factors in concert gives rise to self-regulation. Now, these changes don't happen overnight. It's a gradual process. In the initial stages of meditation, we have to bring in a lot of effort to sit down to meditate. But if you progress like that, in the middle stage, we can sit down to meditation without any effort. But the moment we start meditating, our mind starts wandering all over. And we have to bring in a lot of effort to bring the mind back to the meditative object. And in the advanced stage of meditation, we can sit down to meditate without any effort. And when you start meditating also, our mind will be well focused on the meditative object without putting any effort. That is the stage of effortless being seen in advanced stages of meditation. So likewise, there are a lot of published data on the benefits of meditation on the brain, on so many different aspects of it. These are all confirmed research publications. Some what it improves: job satisfaction, brain response to stress, and so on. All published data on this subject. I will also show you, you don't have to read the details of these slides. I'm projecting it only to show you the quality of the research that has been carried out. They've been looking at very precisely the region of the brain that has been affected, the study design, whether these were cross-sectional studies, the type of meditation, and the findings that were eventually determined by recourse to neuroimaging techniques. Now, these are cross-sectional studies, and here again the meditation technique, what happens in those who are meditating, the controls, the type of meditation, and the changes that took place, the structural changes that took place, and the key areas affected. Very, very precise studies. So the current status of research then, Dharma friends, with regard to meditation and its impact on the brain, is that we have a very complex family of meditation practices ranging all these areas, but the most of the research has been on mindfulness meditation. And even though this research is still very much in its infancy, the quantum of research done, as well as the consistency of the results, make us conclude that the beneficial impact of meditation on the brain is indubitable. So to wrap up this presentation then, as far as the structural changes of the brain is concerned, as a result of meditation as an intervention, 3 regions of the brain are affected, essentially the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. In the prefrontal cortex, there's an increase in the gray matter density, there's an enhancement of the cortical thickness, and increased glyrification, with the corollary being increase in the surface area of the prefrontal cortex and increased its functionality. The hippocampus, concerned with our memory, increases in size. Amygdala, concerned with emotion behavior, decreases in size. So these are the main consistent structural changes in the brain detected when in those who have been meditating. Now, if I were to translate all these into a functional impact, to see the extent to which these structural changes could impact our day-to-day practice of those who are treading this Eightfold Noble Path, well, very clearly then, our improved emotional regulation helps us to manage our feelings, that is Vedana. Continued practice will build within us all these divine abodes, the Brahma Vihara, of metta, karuna, mudita, and upekka, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And we will also have better control of our impulses. That means it will aid our practice of sila. Sila is the most essential prerequisite for anyone treading this path. So it is this changes in the brain enables us to practice our sila well. Then reduction of stress is a result of decreased activity of the amygdala, and also there's a reduction in the level of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and neuroplasticity brings about the increase of the ability of the brain to form these neuronal pathways. And this is what Buddha taught us more than 2,600 years ago, that mental training can have a lasting transformation. So this is explicable in terms of the neuroplasticity that has been proven by this research related to the brain. Another factor that happens is important is the enhanced executive function, so that we'll be very comfortable, very developed in our voice attention, that is yoniso manasikara. And there's an increased capacity of metacognition, so that we'll be more powerful in our mindfulness and clear comprehension. So sati sampajana is a attended benefit of this increased metacognition that takes place as a result of the brain changes. There's improved attention and concentration. One could attain this samadhi very easily. And there's also a reduction in the activity in our default mode of network, which is associated with mind. All the time you find our thoughts are wandering. That is our default mode. But a reduction of this activity seen by meditation helps us to curb, attenuate this thought propagation, that is reduction in prapanya, or the thought proliferation. Now, enhanced functioning of the prefrontal cortex supports our moment-to-moment awareness. That is sati, mindfulness is made very powerful. And that supports the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Satara Satipatthana, Kaya-anupassana, Vedana-anupassana, Chitta-anupassana, and Dhamma-anupassana. The practice of this is facilitated by this augmentation of our mindfulness. Enhanced metacognition, this is a very important attribute of the benefit of meditation. And metacognition enables us to practice vipassana very easily, because the mind in metacognition, the mind is thinking of the mind itself. We see the thoughts, what it arises, how the thought processes are working. So this quality will develop our wisdom, the panya, and a person who develops this panya or the wisdom is in a better position to observe the 3 essential characteristics of all our thoughts as Anitta, Dukkha, and Anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self nature. Buddha has taught that the mind is trainable. And today, in this age and time, a lot of studies have been done, and scientists have proven with good evidence that there are changes in the brain. And what is most interesting is that these changes in the brain support that training. So the practice of mindfulness causes certain brain changes, and that support the practice of mindfulness. So it's a sort of a beneficial cycle. The practice of mindfulness improves as a result of these brain changes with all its beneficial ramifications. So in conclusion then, Dhamma friends, a person who meditates develops a clear, calm mind, is well focused, is free of stress, and has controlled emotions. They have not annihilated the emotions. We will have these emotions as long as we have a primitive brain. Unless we ablate the limbic system, we will have these emotions. But the importance is people who meditate have good control of these emotions. They also have the capability of accessing very rapidly relevant data from a large reserve of memory reserve. And this is enabled by the profound ramifications and the synaptic connections that develop during with different parts of the brain, as well as structural and functional changes that take place in key areas of the brain. And all these changes in the brain are so transformative that a meditator is better facilitated to follow this eightfold path to liberation. And all these principal steps in the eightfold path, Sila, Sati, Samadhi, and Prajna, will develop in sequential fashion to the eventual attainment of liberation. All that will be made feasible only by the consistent practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness practice sporadically is not going to help. It has to be consistent practice, and that's what will enable you to progress on this path in this way from sila up to panya, and then the liberation. Buddha's teachings is profound, very profound. Now, what I have presented to you today is some scientific data on this area, but this data and this evidence is minuscule when you think of how profound the Buddha's knowledge and wisdom is. So don't think too much about this, just meditate. And when you meditate, you will experience the benefits of meditation yourself. And that is the real evidence which will supersede all the evidence provided by scientists. If I were to give you an analogy, think of a pudding, made by a top chef, a very special recipe. And then if you give it to scientists, they'll make very detailed analysis of the chemical constituents, make various measurements of its consistency, the viscosity and all that, apply various chemical formulae, and they will predict quite accurately that this pudding will taste like this. This is the degree of sweetness. This is the degree of saltiness. This is the extent of its sourness and all that. This is the texture. All this they will provide scientific evidence to show that. But what is the proof? You will know what that pudding tastes like only when you eat it. So the proof for the pudding is eat it. So likewise, if you want to know the benefits of meditation, you need to meditate, and then only you will experience its benefits. And never forget what the Buddha had uttered on so many occasions, appamado, appamado, appamado. All the time he has been telling this. And even at his parinibbana, just lying down under a sultry in Kusinara, ready for his parinibbana. When he breathed his last, the last word he uttered was also Vaidhamma Sankara Appamadena Sampadeva. So don't ever forget this word Appamado. Every second of our life state is important, second, minute, hour, or weeks or months. We don't know for how long we live. So meditate and meditate and meditate. So consistent mindfulness that will enable you to experience these benefits. So with those parting words, I shall end this presentation, and I thank all of you all for your very patient attention. Thank you so much.